The Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted over 381 days, started when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man and was arrested. Following her arrest, E.D. Nixon and Joanne Robinson worked to spread the word of the boycott, and the usual 30,000 black people that regularly used the buses found other means of transport. The Montgomery Improvement Association was created by ministers to coordinate the boycott and invited Martin Luther King Jr., who, following the boycott, will be made into a symbol of black resistance. The objectives of the boycott were courteous treatment of black passengers, eating on first-come, first-served basis, and the employment of black drivers. However, the bus company refused to compromise, and the boycott continued, causing the company to suffer great financial losses. Violence against the participants erupted, gaining huge publicity, leading to many donations that worked to sustain the boycott. Success was eventually achieved on December 21, 1956, when the Supreme Court ruling that the segregated transport was unconstitutional came into effect, and the bus company was forced to comply. The boycott showed that the economic power of blacks and the effectiveness of organized collective action that would start to influence future demonstrations. The sit-ins began in Greensboro, North Carolina, when 4 black students entered a Woolworth store and refused to leave the whites-only lunch counter. The students faced much harassment, and Woolworth's profits fell drastically, leading to the desegregation of the counters within a year. Nashville, Tennessee was another location where sit-ins were prominent. The students targeted various stores, and the people began boycotting. A jail no bail policy was adopted, overflowing the jails. Unfortunately, only modest gains were achieved, and Nashville took another 4 years before official desegregation of its public areas. The Freedom Rides were launched by CORE to test the Supreme Court's ban on segregated interstate transport. 7 black and 6 whites traveled together through the South, ignoring segregation laws. They were met with violence such as firebombings and beatings. SNCC eventually joined the rides, and the riders were met with the Klansmen, who also attacked reporters and photographers. The federal government were reluctant to intervene, but were forced to due to violence and disruption, successfully leading to the end of segregated public transport.
Because of the different civil rights organizations on the rise, King's organization, the SCLC, decided it had to prove a success and thus launched Project Confrontation, which aimed to put economic pressure on the city of Birmingham to eliminate segregation. Birmingham was described by King as by far the USA's worst big city for racism. So it was a perfect city for the project to take place in, since it would bring out the violent white supremacists who would help gain national sympathy for King's cause. In the end, after many demonstrations and riots, Project Confrontation was successful in gaining national attention and spreading the movement, although very little change occurred in Birmingham itself. The March on Washington occurred on August 1963 with the goal to encourage the passage of a new civil rights bill, as well as an executive action that would increase black employment. With many of the major civil rights leaders collaborating, the march attracted 250,000 people, including many whites. To top it off, King held his famous "I Had a Dream" speech, which captivated audience around the nation and the world. Although its success at getting the civil rights bill passed is disagreed upon, what is for certain is that the march was a major turning point of the civil rights movement, as it brought the issues of segregation to the national level in full view to the rest of the world. The Freedom Summer was an SNCC voter registration campaign that occurred in Mississippi during the summer of 1964, due to the fact that although half of Mississippi's population is African American, only 5.2% of them could vote. With voting registration centers requiring them to answer impossible questions, as well as running during inconvenient hours, it made it challenging for blacks to register to vote, and in turn resulted in there being no black representation in the state. The SNCC decided to change the statistic by attempting to get as many African Americans registered to vote as possible. The movement was met with backlash that led to the death of 3 civil rights workers, which in turn led many from the North to volunteer and help the campaign. While only 1,200 out of the 17,000 black Mississippians were able to register, it succeeded in creating freedom schools as well as gaining national recognition of the movement.
Martin Luther King Jr. started out as one of the church leaders that began to help with the mobilization of the black community prior to the Montgomery bus boycott. After the boycott began, King became considered a great leader. Essentially, it was agreed upon by the community that he would do a great job representing them. With the leadership came the new umbrella organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was led by King. He frequently stressed nonviolent protests and to remain peaceful at all times. One of his preferred tactics was to draw attention to abuses, which would then raise awareness. King then went on to create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is one of the most prominent civil rights organizations in the movement. King participated in and led many different demonstrations and movements, such as Birmingham, the Albany Movement, and the March on Washington. At the March on Washington in August 1963, King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. The March on Washington is often considered one of the major milestones that helped pass the Civil Rights Act. King helped to raise awareness of the mistreatment and racism that was occurring in many southern cities by bringing awareness to the abuses that many committed towards blacks, especially by police. His actions were of great importance, and he was a successful leader. His actions in many of his demonstrations and protests, including Birmingham and Selma, helped to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Overall, Martin Luther King Jr. was often seen as the face of the civil rights movement and responsible for much of the progress that was made, but there were many others that were also very significant. Malcolm X was originally associated with the Nation of Islam until he departed from it in March of 1964. He became a very prominent leader in the Black Power movement. Malcolm often advocated for blacks to defend themselves by any means necessary, completely contradicting King's calls for peaceful protest. Malcolm was very critical of King in general, once calling the March on Washington the farce on Washington. Malcolm X did accomplish a significant amount. He helped bring attention to the terrible conditions of the ghettos and was considered a great role model for the black youth. He also inspired new generations of black leaders, including the future leader of SNCC, Stokely Carmichael, and the future leader of CORE, Floyd McKissick. Overall, Malcolm advertised and encouraged critical thinking on race problems as well as self-help. In 1964, he ended up establishing the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Essentially, Malcolm X is often considered the harbinger of Black power. During the years 1961 to 1963, John F. Kennedy was President of the United States. Throughout his presidency, there was a significant rise in black activism, although the responses of him and his administration were often unenthusiastic. He even remarked that SNCC was unnecessarily provocative and violent. During the summer of 1963, when the March on Washington was proposed, he tried to oppose it. He was often slow to help with segregation and racism due to white and congressional opposition. During his campaign for presidency, he did make big promises, specifically about ending discrimination in housing, but was hesitant to actually deliver. He also faced a significant amount of criticism from the American population. 70% of Southern whites and 50% of all Americans felt that he was moving too quickly on immigration. Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act in March 1963. His approval rating significantly dropped in the South to 44% due to his support for it, but it is considered one of the most important things that Kennedy did for the movement.
The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, was established in 1909. One of the main founders of the NAACP was W.E.B. Du Bois, a highly educated black man from the North. The NAACP is both the oldest and the largest civil rights organization to date. The organization has both black and white members that fought to end inequality through mainly litigation, employing the most qualified lawyers and professionals available. The NAACP also had a magazine called The Crisis, which gained massive popularity by the 1920s. The NAACP supported the Montgomery bus boycott, with E.D. Nixon, a main leader of the boycott, going on to become the president of the Alabama state of the NAACP, which is ironic because the NAACP's involvement in the boycott actually ended up getting them banned in Alabama. The organization also assisted the MIA, or the Montgomery Improvement Association, in challenging federal laws, segregation laws in federal court. Though the NAACP preferred pursuing legal change over sit-ins and protests, they still provided resources and support for sit-ins happening all over the country. Overall, the NAACP was one of the biggest organizations in terms of size and impact of the civil rights movement. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, was established in January 1957 as a direct result of the Montgomery bus boycott. The SCLC was founded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as other ministers who sought to exploit the power of black churches. The SCLC used support from black churches to hold mass protests and demonstrations against segregation and discrimination. The SCLC put a heavy emphasis on nonviolence and often encouraged their younger audience to be less confrontational when it came to protests like sit-ins, which usually didn't happen. Even so, they still provided funding and aid for sit-ins across the country. They also acknowledged that though they didn't support violence, the violent nature of many of the protests attracted media attention, which was a positive. Support for the LCLC was one of the reasons that sit-ins were so successful, and their nonviolent and civilized approach boosted the credibility of the SCLC as well as the civil rights movement as a whole. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was established in April 1960. SNCC was founded by Ella Baker, a civil rights activist, former member of the NAACP, and one of the leading female figures of the civil rights movement. Her intention for SNCC was to pursue justice through protest and mobilized support, rather than just relying on litigation. SNCC members were made up of students, just like us, even though they were college students, so not really the same, but close enough. Most of the students were black and from southern colleges, but there were some white members and northerners as well. SNCC was behind many of the sit-ins that took place all over the country. One of the biggest events that was put on by SNCC was the Freedom Summer, which was a voter registration drive in Mississippi in 1964. There were 700 volunteers for the Freedom Summer, and volunteers were met with violence from the KKK. This violence drew national attention to SNCC and their cause, which boosted their reach and power. The violence and commotion of Freedom Summer eventually led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965.